Hi everyone, so the following clips are taken from Lex Friedman podcast. You can find the links of that in the description. I have made a specific playlist of the podcast that I preferred and I listen and from which I have taken these clips. You can find the link of those in description or somewhere around. I have no rights over it. I hope it does not copyright it and all. It is just for my memory. It is like a notes for me. So that's all it is. I hope you enjoy it if you are listening to it. If you want a proper talk on the things, if any of the points, you can like see the name in the video and go to that specific podcast and listen to the complete podcast. I recommend it if you want to talk about. Like, I'm listening it, so obviously I'm recommending. I don't waste my time around. Similar podcast script compilation notes is uploaded on various other channels of my own, depending on respective persona field. So if you want, you can check them out. These all are just my preferred topics and stuff to talk about. You can go and listen to the full podcast. Thank you. Have a good day. I hope you enjoy the clip.
Do you think we would be able to find a common language?
Well, by the time we're saying aliens are visiting us, we've already prejudiced the whole story. Because the concept of an alien actually visiting, so to speak, we already know they're kind of things that make sense to talk about visiting. So we already know they exist in the same kind of physical setup that we do. They're not, it's not just radio signals. It's an actual thing that shows up and so on. So I think in terms of, can one find ways to communicate? Well, the best example we have of this right now is AI. I mean, that's our first sort of example of alien intelligence. And the question is, how well do we communicate with AI? If you were in the middle of a neural net and you open it up and it's like, what are you thinking? Can you discuss things with it? It's not easy, but it's not absolutely impossible. So I think given the setup of your question, aliens visiting, I think the answer is yes, one will be able to find some form of communication, whatever communication means. Communication requires notions of purpose and things like this. It's a kind of philosophical quagmire.
So how do we design an IQ test for machines, an intelligent test for machines?
All right. So in the paper, I outline a number of requirements that you should expect of such a test. And in particular, we should start by acknowledging the priors that we expect to be required in order to perform the test. So we should be explicit about the priors, right? And if the goal is to compare machine intelligence and human intelligence, then we should assume human cognitive priors, right? And secondly, we should make sure that we are testing for skill acquisition ability, skill acquisition efficiency in particular, and not for skill itself, meaning that every task featured in your test should be novel and should not be something that you can anticipate. So for instance, it should not be possible to brute force the space of possible questions, right? To pre-generate every possible question and the answer. So it should be tasks that cannot be anticipated, not just by the system itself, but by the creators of the system, right?
And again, I hasten to say AI safety is hugely important. Yeah. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be thinking about those risks. Totally on board for that. What often follows for me is the thought that, there's another kind of narrative that might be relevant, which is when we think of humans gaining more and more information about, like human life, the narrative there is usually that they gain more and more wisdom and more, they get closer to enlightenment and they become more benevolent and, like the Buddha is that's a totally different narrative. And why isn't it the case that we imagine that the AI systems that we're creating are just they're going to figure out more and more about the way the world works and the way that humans interact, and they'll become beneficent. I'm not saying that will happen. I don't honestly expect that to happen without some careful setting things up very carefully. But it's another way things could go, right? And
yeah, and I would even push back on that. I personally believe that the most trajectories, natural human trajectories, will lead us towards progress. So for me, there is a kind of sense that most trajectories in AI development will lead us into trouble. To me, and we overfocus on the worst case. It's like in computer science, theoretical computer science, there's been this focus on worst case analysis. There's something appealing to our human mind at some lowest level to be. I mean, we don't want to be eaten by the tiger, I guess. So we want to do the worst case analysis. But the reality is, that shouldn't stop us from actually building out all the other trajectories which are potentially leading to all the positive worlds, all the enlightenment. There's a book, Enlightenment Now, with Steven Pinker and so on. This is looking generally at human progress. And there's so many ways that human progress can happen with AI. And I think you have to do that research. You have to do that work. You have to do not just the AI safety work of the one worst case analysis. How do we prevent that? But the actual tools and the glue and the mechanisms of human AI interaction that would lead to all the positive directions that can go.
Yeah,
it's
right.
It's a super exciting area, right?
Yeah, we should be spending a lot of our time saying what can go wrong.
If we're concerned about AI and the threat of AI, a la Nick Bostrom, existentialist threat, I think having an intelligence that has empathy, right? Why do we find abusing a dog? Why do most of us find that abhorrent, or abusing any animal, right? Why do we find that abhorrent? Because we have this thing called empathy, which, if you look at the Greek, really means feeling with. I feel pathos, empathy. I have feeling with you. I see somebody else suffer. That isn't even my conspecific. Right? It's not a person. It's not a love. It's not my wife or my kids. It's a dog. But I feel naturally, most of us, not all of us, most of us will feel emphatic. And so it may well be in the long-term interest of survival of Homo sapiens sapiens that if we do build AGI and it really becomes very powerful, that it has an emphatic response and doesn't just exterminate humanity.
So as part of the full conscious experience, to create a consciousness, artificial or in our human consciousness, do you think fear, maybe we're going to get into your earlier days with Nietzsche and so on, but do you think fear and suffering are essential to have consciousness? Do you have to have the full range of experience to have a system that has experience? Or can you have a system that only has very particular kinds of very positive experiences?
Look, you can have, in principle, people have done this in the rat, where you implant an electrode in the hypothalamus, the pleasure center of the rat, and the rat stimulates itself above and beyond anything else. It doesn't care about food or natural sex or drink anymore. It just stimulates itself because it's such a pleasurable feeling. I guess it's like an orgasm, just you have, all day long. And so, a priori, I see no reason why you need, why you need a great variety. Now, clearly to survive, that wouldn't work, right? But if I engineered artificially, I don't think you need a great variety of conscious experience. You could have just pleasure or just fear. It might be a terrible existence, but I think that's possible, at least on conceptual logical ground. Because any real creature, whether artificially engineered, you want to give it fear, the fear of extinction, right, that we all have. And you also want to give it positive, appetitive states that you want the machine encouraged to do because they give the machine positive feedback.
Another interesting kind of disaster is that maybe intelligent life is not wiped out, but all consciousness is wiped out. So just say you thought, unlike what I was saying a moment ago, that there are two different kinds of intelligent systems, some which are conscious and some which are not. And just say it turns out that we create AGI with high degree of intelligence, meaning high degree of sophistication in its behavior, but with no consciousness at all. That AGI could take over the world, maybe, but then there'd be no consciousness in this world. This would be a world of zombies. Some people have called this the zombie apocalypse. It's like, because it's an apocalypse for consciousness. Consciousness is gone. You've merely got this super intelligent, non-conscious robots. And I would say that's a moral disaster in the same way, in almost the same way that the world with no intelligent life is a moral disaster. All value and meaning may be gone.
The fact that you have a device that cannot explain itself is a major, major difficulty. and we're already seeing that. I mean, this is really something that is happening. So.
What about the leap to creating intelligent life on Earth?
Yeah.
However, again, we define intelligence, of course, but let's just even say Homo sapiens, the modern intelligence in our human brain. Do you have a sense of what's involved in that leap and how big of a leap that is?
So AI would count in this, or you really want life? You want really an organism in some sense?
AI would count, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, AI would count. But
well, let's say artificial consciousness, right? So I do not think we are on the threshold of creating artificial consciousness. I think it's possible. I'm not, again, very educated about how close we are, but my impression is not that we're really close because we understand how little we understand of consciousness and what it is. So if we don't have any idea what it is, it's hard to imagine we're on the threshold of making it ourselves. But it's doable. It's possible. I don't see any obstacles in principle. So yeah, I would hold out some interest in that happening eventually.
I think in general, consciousness, I think we'll be just surprised how easy consciousness is once we create intelligence.
Yeah.
I think consciousness is a thing that that's just something we all fake.
Well, good. No, actually, I like this idea that in fact consciousness is way less mysterious than we think.
Yeah.
Because we're all at every time, at every moment, less conscious than we think we are, right? We can fool things. And I think that plus the idea that you not only have artificial intelligent systems, but you put them in a body, right? Mm-hmm. Give them a robot body. That will help the faking a lot.
Yeah, I think creating consciousness in artificial consciousness is as simple as asking a Roomba to say, I'm conscious and refusing to be talked out of it.
Could be. It could be. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm almost being silly, but that's what we do. That's what we do with each other. This the kind of that consciousness is also a social construct, and a lot of our ideas of intelligence is a social construct. And so, reaching that bar involves something that's beyond. Doesn't necessarily involve the fundamental understanding of how you go from electrons to neurons to cognition.
Typically, death is defined as the end of life, and life is defined before death.
Before death.
Okay, so we don't have really very good definitions. Intelligence, we don't have a rigorous definition. We know something how to measure. It's called IQ or G factors, right? And we're beginning to build it in a narrow sense, right? Like Go, AlphaGo and Watson and, Google cars and Uber cars and all of that. That's still narrow AI. And some people are thinking about artificial general intelligence. But roughly, as we said before, it's something to do with the ability to learn and to adapt to new environments. But that is, as I said, also it's radical difference from experience. Mm-hmm. And it's very unclear if you build a machine that has AGI, it's not at all a priori. It's not at all clear that this machine will have consciousness. It may or may not.
So let's ask it the other way. Do you think if you were to try to build an artificial general intelligence system, do you think figuring out how to build artificial consciousness would help you get to an AGI? So, or put another way, do you think intelligent requires consciousness?
In human, it goes hand in hand. In human, or I think in biology, consciousness and intelligence goes hand in hand, qua evolution, because the brain evolved to be highly complex. Complexity via the theory, integrated information theory, is sort of ultimately is what is closely tied to consciousness. Ultimately, it's causal power upon itself. And so in evolved systems, they go together. In artificial system, particularly in digital machines, they do not go together. And if you ask me point blank, is Alexa 20.0 in the year 2040, when she can easily pass every Turing test, is she conscious? No. Even if she claims she's conscious. In fact, you could even do a more radical version of this thought experiment. We can build a computer simulation of the human brain. You know what Henry Markram in the Blue Brain Project or the Human Brain Project in Switzerland is trying to do. Let's grant them all the success. So in 10 years, we have this perfect simulation of the human brain. Every neuron is simulated, and it has a larynx, and it has motor neurons, it has Broca's area. And of course, it'll talk and it'll say, hi, I just woken up. I feel great. Okay. Even that computer simulation that can in principle map onto your brain will not be conscious. Why? Because it simulates. It's a difference between the simulated and the real. So it simulates the behavior associated with consciousness. It will, if it's done properly, will have all the intelligence that that particular person they're simulating has. But simulating intelligence is not the same as having conscious experiences. And I give you a really nice metaphor that engineers and physicists typically get. I can write down Einstein's field equation, 9 or 10 equations that describe the link in general relativity between curvature and mass. I can do that. I can run this on my laptop to predict that the black hole at the center of our galaxy will be so massive that it'll twist space-time around it so no light can escape. It's a black hole, right? But funny, have you ever wondered, why doesn't this computer simulation suck me in? Right? It simulates gravity, but it doesn't have the causal power of gravity. That's a huge difference. So it's a difference between the real and the simulated, just like it doesn't get wet inside a computer when the computer runs code that simulates a weather storm. And so in order to have artificial consciousness, you have to give it the same causal power as a human brain.
Yes.
You have to build so-called a neuromorphic machine that has hardware that is very similar to the human brain, not a digital clocked von Neumann computer.
So that's just to clarify, though. You think that consciousness is not required to create human level intelligence. It seems to accompany in the human brain, but for a machine, not.
That's correct.
It feels like we're very human centric. And so the only way we would be convinced that something is conscious is basically the thing demonstrates the illusion of consciousness. That we can never really know whether it's conscious or not. And in fact, that almost feels like it doesn't matter then. Or does it still matter to you that something is conscious or it demonstrates consciousness? You still see that fundamental distinction.
I think to a lot of people, whether a system is conscious or not matters hugely for many things, like how we treat it, can it suffer, and so on. But still, that leaves open the question, how can we ever know? And it's true that it's awfully hard to see how we can know for sure whether a system is conscious. I suspect that sociologically, the thing that's going to convince us that a system is conscious is in part things like social interaction, conversation, and so on, where they seem to be conscious. They talk about their conscious states or just talk about being happy or sad or finding things meaningful or being in pain. That will tend to convince us if a system genuinely seems to be conscious, we don't treat it as such. Eventually, it's going to seem like a strange form of racism or speciesism or somehow not to acknowledge them.
I truly believe that, by the way. I believe that there is going to be something akin to the civil rights movement, but for robots. I think the moment you have a Roomba say, please don't kick me, that hurts. Just say it.
Yeah.
I think that will fundamentally change the fabric of our society.
I think you're probably right, although it's going to be very tricky because just say we've got the technology where these conscious beings can just be created and multiplied by the thousands by flicking a switch. And the legal status is going to be different, but ultimately their moral status ought to be the same. And the civil rights issue is going to be a huge mess.
Convolution in neural networks is a trick for efficiency, trick. And the brain does a whole nother kind of thing, I guess.
Correct. So you need to understand the principles of processing so that you can still apply engineering tricks where you want it to. You don't want to be slavishly mimicking all the things of the brain. So it should be one input, and I think it is extremely helpful. But it should be the point of really understanding so that you know when to deviate from it.
What other interesting problems are there, the open problems in brain-inspired approaches that you're thinking about?
I mean, everything is open, right? Like, no problem is solved, right? I think of perception as kind of thing that you have to build, but the last thing that you will be actually solved. Because if you do not build perception system in the right way, you cannot build concept system in the right way. So you have to build a perception system, however wrong that might be. You have to still build that and learn concepts from there, and then keep iterating. And finally, perception will get solved fully when perception, cognition, language, all those things work together finally.
People talk about the Turing test or some descendant of it. I feel like that's the ultimate Turing test. Is there an AI system that can not only convince us that it knows how to reason and it knows how to interpret language, but that we're comfortable saying, yeah, that AI system's a good guy. I mean,
on the warmth scale,
yeah,
whatever warmth is, we kind of intuitively understand it, but we also want to be able to we don't understand it explicitly enough yet to be able to engineer it.
Exactly.
And that's an open scientific question. You kind of alluded to it several times in the human AI interaction. That's a question that should be studied, and probably one of the most important questions. As a side note, let me say that the serious, rigorous, scientific study of artificial general intelligence is a rare thing. The mainstream machine learning community works on very narrow AI with very narrow benchmarks. This is very good for incremental and sometimes big incremental progress. On the other hand, the outside the mainstream, renegade, you could say, AGI community works on approaches that verge on the philosophical and even the literary without big public benchmarks. Walking the line between the two worlds is a rare breed, but it doesn't have to be. I ran the AGI series at MIT as an attempt to inspire more people to walk this line. DeepMind and OpenAI for a time, and still, on occasion, walk this line. If you could give advice to a young researcher, sort of dreaming of understanding or creating human-level intelligence or consciousness, what would you say?
Just follow your dreams. Read read widely.
No, I mean, I suppose what discipline, what is the pursuit that they should take on? Is it neuroscience? Is it computational cognitive science? Is it philosophy? Is it computer science or robotics?
No, in a sense that, so the only known system that have high level of intelligence is Homo sapiens. So if you wanted to build it, it's probably good to continue to study closely what humans do. So cognitive neuroscience, somewhere between cognitive neuroscience on the one hand, then some philosophy of mind, and then AI, computer science. You can look at all the original ideas, neural networks. They all came from neuroscience, right? Reinforcement, whether it's Snarky, Minsky building his Snarky, or whether it's, the early Hubel and Wiesel experiments at Harvard that then gave rise to networks and then multi-layer networks. So it may well be possible. In fact, some people argue that to make the next big step in AI, once we'll realize the limits of deep convolutional networks, they can do certain things, but they can't really understand. Right. So some people make the argument, in order to go to the next step, where you really want to build machines that understand in a way you and I, we have to go to psychology. We need to understand how we do it and how our brains enable us to do it. And so therefore, being on the cusp, it's also so exciting, right? To try to understand better our nature and then to take some of those insights and build them. So I think the most exciting thing is somewhere in the interface between cognitive science, neuroscience, AI, computer science, and philosophy of mind.
So in the space of advice, somebody who's interested in getting started in machine learning or reinforcement learning, what advice would you give to maybe an undergraduate student or maybe even younger? What are the first steps to take? And further on, what are the steps to take on that journey?
So something that I think is important to do is to not be afraid to spend time imagining the kind of outcome that you might like to see. So, one outcome might be a successful career, a large paycheck or something, or state-of-the-art results on some benchmark. But hopefully that's not the thing that's the main driving force for somebody. But I think that if someone who's a student considering a career in AI, takes a little while, sits down and thinks what do I really want to see? What do I want to see a machine do? What do I want to see a robot do? What do I want to do? And what do I want to see a natural language system? Just imagine imagine it almost like a commercial for a future product or something, or like something that you'd like to see in the world, and then actually sit down and think about the steps that are necessary to get there. And hopefully that thing is not a better number on ImageNet classification. It's probably like an actual thing that we can't do today that would be really awesome. Whether it's a robot butler or a really awesome healthcare decision-making support system, whatever it is that you find inspiring. And I think that thinking about that and then backtracking from there and imagining the steps needed to get there will actually lead to much better research. It'll lead to rethinking the assumptions. It'll lead to working on the bottlenecks that other people aren't working on.